welcome back to the channel. This is a video on how to paint MDF like a professional. First thing you're going to need is a sanding sealer. It doesn't have to be a Minwax, it could be any sanding sealer, as long as it is a lacquer-based sanding sealer. Don't use any water-based products because it just seeps into the porous material of MDF and swells and makes it fuzzy, and it never comes out very well at all. And all you want to do is you need at least 2 coats. I wouldn't go any more than 2 coats, and I wouldn't just put 1 coat either. And you just brush it on. It seeps in. You'll see it seep in like crazy because MDF is extremely porous. And I found that this is truly the best method of painting MDF. I've tried multiple methods of sealing the ends, and nothing comes out as good as a sanding sealer. Unfortunately, it does take up to an hour to dry, which is a pain if you're trying to get things out the door, but if you want it to look professional, this is the method to go. Here's another good tip. A lot of times people like to shy away from a chemical-based or a volatile-based paint or thinner or whatever it is because they can't clean the brushes. They don't have a wash bucket. But if you just pick yourself up one of these small containers like this, a little empty paint container, they're like $3 at Ace Hardware, and you fill it up with lacquer thinner. You just dip your brush in there. And it comes out clean. I tend to also stick with using water-based products because that way I can just bring it in the house and clean it off in the sink. Okay, it's been about an hour and it's time for the second coat. But before you put the second coat, you must sand off about 80% of what you put on there. You want to just have what's soaked into the MDF to stay, and anything on the surface you kind of want to sand. You want to sand that off. Okay, now that you've sanded the first coat of sanding sealer, again, make sure you only sand about 80% of it off. You don't want to sand it back down to the MDF. You want to make sure there's what's soaked into the MDF is left behind. A note to add is I highly suggest using a brush-on sanding sealer. The spray ones don't seem to seep in as much as you would want it to, and they kind of just lay on the surface, which if you put 3 coats or 4 coats of spray, it's just as good, but I don't find it as efficient. It dries about the same amount of time, so you're sitting there doing 3 or 4 coats every hour. It takes 3 hours to get a project done. Okay, the second coat has finished drying, and it's a really good idea to sand it one more time. I wouldn't go 80% off. I would try and keep it around like 20%. You just want to smooth it out and take away any scratch marks or lines from brushing it on, because that will show up after the paint. Another quick tip, I suggest using a fine grit sandpaper around 220 or 320. That's what I'm using on my Orbit sander, and it's doing a pretty good job at a quick rate. I wouldn't use anything any more coarse than that. It tends to leave really deep scratches in that sanding sealer, and it actually shows up after you prime it and paint it. You want it to be as smooth as possible. Any type of actual primer that has to say primer It has different characteristics than paint. It tends to seep into any cracks or imperfections that you have that you can see pretty easily. It tends to hide them, and that's what you want. You want it to be like a perfect painted piece with no imperfections. So use a primer. Not a paint and primer. They do not work the same as just a straight primer. I typically only use about 1 coat of primer. I'll only ever put 2 if I had to sand it down or there was an imperfection that was too noticeable. Okay, it's been about an hour and the primer is dry. If your primer does not need to be sanded, you can go right ahead and just paint the top coat on. And each one of these is going to get 2 coats of the top coat. Okay, after the 2 top coats have dried, only on the flat and the satin, I'm going to put a satin crystal clear on the satin and a flat crystal clear on the flat. After you're done putting your top coats down and they have dried overnight, this is what they should look like after you are completely done. A perfect edge and no blotchiness, and the edge is painted perfectly with no sponginess or fuzziness that comes from painting MDF. These got a little bit of dust on them, but they're just samples. On an actual product, I would be doing it in a much cleaner aspect. Alright guys, thanks for watching. I hope this was educational for people who are trying to paint MDF. It does take a process, but it is possible and it comes out perfect when you do it right, and it is well worth the trouble. Thanks again, and I hope to see you guys on the next one. Do it the Bob Ross style and beat the devil out of it. That works.